Hello, everyone, and welcome to Staffer, the show about people who work in government or politics at any level and what they take from the experience. I'm your host, Jim Papa, a partner at Global Strategy Group and a former staffer myself. Our guest this week is Ann Caprara, the current Chief of Staff for Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. Ann has been a notable name in Democratic politics in a very short period of time. She started out at Emily's List in research, rising to Deputy Research Director in just 2 years. Before the age of 30, she had served as Chief of Staff for two members of Congress, Congresswoman Betty Sutton of Ohio, and then as Campaign Manager and Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Betsy Markey of Colorado. Over the years that followed, she held several high-level positions in some of the most important organizations in Democratic politics. She was Political Director at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, Vice President of Campaigns at Emily's List, and Executive Director of Priorities USA, the largest Democratic presidential super PAC. Ann has been rightly recognized. In 2019, Politico's Playbook included her on its list of 19 people to watch, and she was recently named by Chicago Magazine as one of the 50 most powerful women in Chicago. I am so pleased to have her as my guest today, and I hope you enjoy her brilliance, her candor, and her humor. We recorded this episode on January 29th. Ann Caprara, welcome to Staffer.
Jim Papa, it is so good to be talking to you again.
It is wonderful to be talking with you as well. The way I like to start these interviews is by talking about kind of where people grew up and how they grew up. But before I dive in, I do need to talk about football, which is something we haven't really talked about in the past. Mm-hmm. You, a proud daughter of Philadelphia. I am a New York Giants fan, and there was a bit of controversy at the end of our seasons.
There was.
I want to see if we can find any agreement between us that the Eagles were right to fire their coach, Doug Peterson.
I don't know if we can. I mean, I have very mixed emotions about the firing of Doug Peterson. And I will say that it was happening in the midst of like a ton of drama in our country. And it did provide a little bit of a respite that Eagles Twitter was fully run amok over Doug Peterson. So I don't know. I haven't sorted out my feelings about the firing of Doug Peterson.
Well, in a parallel universe, Giants Twitter was also very engaged in that conversation.
Here's the problem. Doug Peterson took the Eagles to their first Super Bowl ever. Right. And for that, I will be forever grateful to him. So it's a little bit hard to separate my feelings over that with the dumpster fire that was the Eagles season this past year.
Understandable. I do understand that. So I mentioned Philadelphia. Anyone who knows you or follows you on Twitter knows how important it is. Talk to me a bit about growing up and specifically, Ann, I would like to hear you talk about your mom, who you've written really movingly about. You lost at a young age. And just from being someone who reads your posts on Facebook, she sounded like an incredible woman and had such an impact on you. And I'd love to hear you talk about her.
Sure. Well, thanks for asking me. I have to say, of all the podcasts and interviews I've done, I don't get to talk about my mom a lot. So it's nice when I do. I lost her when I was 12 in kind of a tragic car accident. And she was a journalist. She wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer. She actually, right before she died, she had started a company writing and was doing magazines and newspapers and kind of was working freelance, and I think was hoping to grow that business. And unfortunately was cut off really young. But I saw her doing that in kind of some of my most formative years. You know, she was really involved in just she loved reporting and she loved writing. And she would take me with her to, assignments she had. She gave me a typewriter when I was 11 years old, which was kind of a precocious gift for an 11-year-old. And this was pre-computers, all of that. So a typewriter was kind of a big deal. Yeah. And I remember once she took me to a bookathon that a local school was hosting. And she gave me kind of a pad, a piece of paper, and said, go off and do your own interviews. So I did, because I thought that this was a lot of fun. And I came back to the typewriter and I typed up my whole story for her. and I handed it in, and then the story actually came out in the Philadelphia Inquirer a couple of weeks later.
Oh, that's cool.
And I remember actually going through and highlighting the sections that I thought I had contributed to, and I gave her a bill. And I mean, all credit to my mother that she was like, "You're right, here's $5." And but it was, it was, thinking back now, it was like a really formative experience to see her working, and it's very odd because she passed like before social media, before all of the the internet, like all the things that we have today, whereas I feel like when people die in the modern age, there's so much of them that remains online, and so it's a very mixed feeling for me, because going through my career, there's so many things that I would be interested to see what she would think about. And I'd love the chance to talk to her as an adult, and I never really had that. But there are moments, particularly in the stuff that I do, that I really stop and think, wow, I've had an opportunity to do things that I don't think she had the opportunity to do. I mean, she was a woman growing up in the 70s and 80s, really. And I think she never got a chance to go to college. And so I remember in the years before she died, she used to talk about wanting to do speech writing. And she specifically wanted to do speech writing for Bill Bradley. He was running in New Jersey. I think he was thinking about running for Senate. And I remember talking to her about it. Again, I was like 11, and, what was speech writing to an 11-year-old? But it certainly stuck with me through the years. And when I've had the opportunity now on many occasions to write a speech for the governor, for Congress people I've worked for senators. And it's always a poignant moment for me to watch somebody deliver a speech that I've had a role in, because it's something I love to do. It's not my main career. I'm not a speechwriter by trade. I really hold on to it because it's just something I love and I enjoy. And so when I have the opportunity, I do it. But I always sit there and think, wow, I got a chance to do this thing that she really wanted to do. And it's very much a part of my day-to-day life in so many different ways. So
yeah,
it's very cool.
Oh, that is beautiful.
Yeah.
So politics and current events were a part of your growing up. I've asked about your mom, but what about your dad? What was
my dad's still around and kicking. In fact, he still lives in the Philadelphia area. He got his COVID shot this morning, so I was very pleased to hear about that. Look, my dad's he's a trial lawyer, and I think I get a lot of my drive from my dad. He doesn't shy away from an argument. Neither do I. He was probably the first person that I got into political arguments with. I grew up Republican, and I became a Democrat, and as you know, a big Democrat, in college. And so, my father had, he'd been a Reagan Republican. Like, he was just always kind of hawking for the GOP. And you'll appreciate this. In 2010, when I was working for Betsy Markey, he and I were on the phone, and he was telling me how, Democrats are going to raise my taxes, and I don't know who I'm going to vote for in November. And I remember saying to him, Dad, that like if the Democrats lose, that I'm going to lose my job. And it was like this lightning bolt moment for him, because he, I always tell him, you work for a polling firm. I always say it's like that question, like, is this going to impact your personal financial, self?
Yeah.
And my father was like, oh my God, my daughter's going to lose her job if I don't vote Democrat. And he went and switched his voter registration. Like,
nice.
And it was
Good work.
such a like dad thing to do,
Yes.
but I've always appreciated it about him, because he takes as much, pride in my career and follows every little thing I do. And, it's so nice that I have him around, and it's been a while since I've gotten to see him, which has been hard, but he was the first person I called when all the stuff happened with the pandemic, and I said, hey, you this is for real, and I need you to stay safe, because I can't worry about the state of Illinois and you at the same time. but he's always been one of my biggest cheerleaders, and he still is. And he's a funny guy. He's got a real sense of humor, and he's always cracking me up because, you know, he kind of comes on and off social media. You know, he opened a Twitter account years ago, and I was like, please stay as far away from Twitter as you
dangerous.
can. And he was like, you do it. I'm like, it's going to take too long for me to explain to you how dangerous Twitter is. So he kind of has he has a soapbox on Facebook, and but it's always, I miss him and I love him, and he's had a big influence in my life. So
yeah. Well, you know, you mentioned your competitive drive, and something I read about you in preparation for this was a quote from Guy Cecil, who, you know, for those who are very familiar with Democratic politics, they know the name Guy Cecil, who heads up Priorities USA, the biggest Democratic super PAC for presidential candidates. He described you as, quote, relentless in the pursuit of winning, which I love. You know, you're in an official job now. You're a big official job, chief of staff to the governor of Illinois. You've also run many campaigns, and they are certainly the yin and yang, right, of this work. But do you have a preference?
You know, I don't know that I do. I love campaigns. I love being a chief of staff. I think people think they're more different than they actually are. I don't think you can have politics without policy, and I don't think you can have policy without politics. And the intersection of those two things, which I've seen from both sides of the coin here, is fascinating to me. And I think something I've learned on the official side over the years, not just in this job, but, you know, I was working for a member of Congress, is, you know, you can't just campaign with total abandon, right? Like, you really do have to have a sense of, can I keep the promises that I make to the people while I'm campaigning? And on the same side of it, you can't campaign without, or you can't govern without a sense of the politics behind everything you do, and the message and the story that you're telling people about why you're doing something. And so I love the intersection of those two things. I think being on the government side has made me better as a staffer on a campaign, and being a staffer on a campaign has made me better as a staffer on the governor's side, on the government side.
You know, I've talked to audiences where, you know, a question from the audience that's fairly common is like, what will it take to remove the politics from governing?
There's no removing the politics from governing.
Yeah. It's like the flour that is in the cake. Like, everything that comes through is just infused with politics. And that's not wrong, right? That's actually the energy that's infusing the policymaking. I have the same feeling, Jim, and I tell this to people because I get a similar question. You know, how can everything be less political? And this is what I say to people. So I grew up. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, right? And pre-pandemic, when we would come home for Christmas, we always pick a movie for the whole family to see, right? And for years, the controversy over this movie was terrible. Like, you know, there would be fights and arguments, and, you know, somebody would want to see one movie and somebody else had already seen it. And it got so bad that by, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, we decided that we were going to pick the movie over the summer. Like, we were going to say, we know Star Wars is coming out, you know, in December, so no one go see Star Wars. We're going to go see that together. And that's 7 people that love each other, right? Like, so start to take that to Congress or a governor's office or a state legislature or whatever, you know, governmental body you want to think about. And, you know, politics is always going to have a part in it, because politics is about people's passions and the things they're happy about, the things they're mad about, the things they're sad about. And that doesn't mean that, you know, partisan politics should cloud every decision. But it does mean that you should be paying attention to what's driving people and what they're showing up on and what they're listening to and caring about. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I've never thought that's a bad thing. And I think that you ignore that at your own peril, because people do signal to you
what they're going to care about. I mean, you can read the electorate, and I don't think it's actually that hard to do if you're paying attention. So,
yeah. I was going to ask this later, but since we're here now, the situation in Washington today is not good. It's as stressful and as tense and damaged as I've ever seen it. Mm-hmm. But it is not just Washington, right? I mean, obviously the riot happened on Capitol Hill, and it is appalling and devastating emotionally and in reality. Like, people's lives still are at risk today. But that's true for every state capital. It's true for every district office. There are people working in all these places where they're at some level of elevated risk. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about Illinois and what you're experiencing and what's on your mind when you've got to be concerned as a participant in the policymaking process and also as a manager of people who are coming to work every day and they've got families at home.
Sure. Well, look, there's two things I would say at the front. The vast majority of people I've interacted with in Illinois, particularly around the last year, have been wonderful. They know that there are sacrifices that have to be made around controlling the pandemic. They care a great deal about their government, about their neighbor, about the people in and out of office. And as we were saying earlier, there's always a lot of passion in politics, and that's always been a part of it. I will say I've never seen anything like the last year, both professionally and personally, in terms of dealing with the vitriol that comes at us. As to my boss, as a governor, to my staff, who all are working on different aspects of the pandemic. To take a step back for a second, I mean, you and I first met each other because you were working at the White House, in the Obama White House, and I was working for a freshman member of Congress. And when I saw what happened on January 6th, the first thing that came to my mind was, I remember where this started, really. I mean, it has roots in a whole bunch of history in our country, but I can almost take it back to a day and a moment, which is when we passed healthcare on the Hill. Mm-hmm. And, I was working for a freshman member in a red district who had decided to vote yes on the bill. And a ton of Tea Party protesters had showed up on Capitol Hill. Our staff was in the office. We were voting on a weekend. And I remember the Capitol Police actually coming around and saying, we're asking everybody to go home except for the members who were going to go over to vote, because there are people roaming the hallways, shoving things under doors and kind of coming and confronting staffers. And even just on the walk over from the Longworth building to the Capitol, there were all those protesters on the lawn. Nancy Pelosi was making the walk across, and there were people spinning at her and John Lewis. And I remember watching that and thinking, wow, this is pretty wild. This is not something I've ever experienced or been the target of before. And I wasn't, front and center in that. People were focused on my boss. They were focused on Democratic leadership at the time. And so when I saw what happened in January, there was almost like this resigned sense of, yeah, this is the inevitable conclusion of all this. And, what does that look like in Illinois for the past year? Well, I mean, it means I get every threat that comes into the governor. I'm the first person to hear about it. And there certainly have been plenty of those. It means, we make a policy decision around a mitigation effort. And in one instance this year, we had protesters showing up at the homes of our staff. What comes at us on social media is gross. And I don't get the worst of it, actually. Our press secretary, Jordan Abadea, who for a period of time, the governor was giving daily press briefings. And she was reading questions off of a virtual template for people to bring questions in. So she became a person on the media in and of itself, because people were tuning into these press conferences and they were seeing Jordan ask questions. And occasionally she'll tweet out what the replies are to her. And they're as disgusting as you might think they are. It's calls and voicemails. At one point, my personal cell phone got leaked out, and People were leaving messages, and then I had somebody who was calling from an unknown number, and they would just breathe on the other end of the line. And, these things, you deal with them. I think if you're in this business, at some point in time during the course of your career, you will have dealt with something like this. But the sustained nature of it, in some places, the coordinated effort behind it, the governor's family has just the harassment and the targeting of his school-age kids, to the point where, his daughter left the state at one point. It's just, I've never seen anything like it. It's incredibly wearing and hard to deal with. I think we're all conditioned to say, this is the job and you've got to deal with what comes at you. But I've been in this kind of job for a long time, and I've never kind of dealt with what's come at me and at my staff and at my boss over the last year. And it just, I sat down the other night. I had gotten home, and, we're dealing with vaccine rollout and all this other stuff. And I had one of these moments where I just sat down on my stairs because I was just so tired. I had been taking phone calls and I'd been doing everything else. And I ended up calling a friend to talk, and she said, you sound exhausted. And I said, I do. And I said, I am exhausted. I said, and it's a different kind of exhaustion than I'm used to. I'm used to the campaign world where everything's going and going and going, but there's a season to that and there's an end to it. And I'm used to even in government where, you have session and the legislature's in session and you're really involved in that, but there's a season to that too. And it kind of ebbs and flows. And this is just not stopped. It's not ended. There's no, doesn't feel like there's an end in sight, even though I know there is. And I was the only thing I could compare it to is, when someone dies that you really love and you go to their funeral, and then afterwards usually there's a luncheon or something and everybody's kind of laughing and crying and drinking. And then you get home at the end of the night and you're just so tired and you're going to fall asleep, but you're going to wake up the next day and you're going to be just as tired as the night before. And that's what it feels like. I mean, that's really what doing this work right now feels like. And all that stuff that, combined to form whatever happened on January 6th is part of that. And I have tremendous sympathy for what people are going through right now. It is so incredibly hard to deal with the here and now. I don't care who you are, how you've been affected, the people in the best circumstances are feeling the pressure and stress of this. And that's before you get to the people who really have suffered the most. But I remind friends and family and other people who share dumb stuff on Facebook and other things that there is a face that's being targeted by that. And it's in some cases, your relative or your cousin or the staffer that you worked with and interacted with, or the governor and his family. And I think people have to get that through their head anymore, because to a certain degree, they just have stopped remembering that, people are human. And it's terrifying. Yeah.
You have led multiple organizations, chief of staff to 2 different members of Congress, political director at the DSCC, executive director of Priorities USA. You're in the role you're in now. And this year, to your point, has been awful. What do you, as the leader of this organization, obviously under the governor, but as his chief of staff, how do you, what do you communicate to your staff to balance this emotional drain? But there is also a real job to do. And even without COVID, we would be saying we got to put one foot ahead of the other. Now we're dealing with a pandemic, and the demands are higher than ever.
So the first thing I say to them, and I say it to them constantly, is we are going to be judged in months and years and not days and weeks. And it sounds so simple, but as you know, when you get into the tumult of day-to-day social media, press conferences, people sending letters and calling your office and being upset about stuff, when we were in the earliest days of the pandemic and we had to make decisions about mitigations, which was devastatingly hard, and we had no help from the federal government at the time. Everybody had a better plan, according to them, than we did. And there were some that I'm sure were better. I mean, and if I could go back to the beginning and do it all over again, there's plenty of things I would do differently. But I also knew that we just had to pick a path and go. And that sometimes the lack of making a decision, that's making a decision in of itself. So you have to be the engine behind everybody going, okay, like, is that the decision you're making? All right, let's go on to the next one. And I think that's hard for political people because we're used to living in kind of the day-to-day moment of politics and what's hot right now. And this pandemic is so different. You know, it's a course that's got to be charted over time. And you have to understand, you know, what are your goals? And your goals actually have to be really simple in a crisis like this. The governor and I sat down at the beginning of it. He's told this story a million times, but it's so indicative of kind of how we've thought all the way through. You know, we had modelers come to us at the very early months, and because we're trying to get our heads around, like, what is going to happen here, you know, and how much danger are we in, and, you know, what can be done to stop it? And they put a sheet in front of us that said, okay, if you just proceed forward with no shutdowns, no mitigations, no stay-at-home orders, nothing, this many people are going to die. And if you do mitigations, you know, what we've come to call, like, you know, all these mitigation measures, this many less people are going to die. And I'd never been handed a chart like that in my career ever. And I remember just thinking in my head, okay, this is everything very clearly, right? This is just, you have one of two choices. And I brought that into the governor. He had the same, like, oh my God moment with it. And I think he and I think back to that moment like every week, you know, when we're trying to make decisions about what to do next. You know, making sure that our hospitals didn't get overloaded, which, knock on wood, we've managed to be able to do, and now making sure that this vaccine rollout happens as quickly and as efficiently as we can possibly achieve under the circumstances we're in. You know, that stuff, you kind of have to keep it front of mind for everybody. And we laugh a lot in our office. I mean, I'm a big believer in humor, and I try to remember that people need to get up for air every once in a while. You know, when we were in, like, kind of the darkest days of all this, we would do a meeting every night at 7:00 to just, you know, kind of go through what had happened during the day. And I would make everybody stay until three people would share some positive note or story or tweet or text that they had gotten that day. Just so that people would go home remembering, hey, you know, this work we're doing is really important, and there are people who appreciate that we're doing it. But this has been a unique challenge. I mean, having to stay in the office and, like, you know, you can't have a party, you can't take everybody out for a drink, you can't, you know, organize some sort of worse fun event. Like, there's just none of that. Right. So,
right.
It really is just keeping everybody focused on the long-term goal.
So being in a governor's office is so vast compared to many jobs, big jobs in Washington, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, the White House is its own animal, but even if you're a senator or working in a House office, they're much smaller operations, and you have fewer levers to play with. What would be helpful, since you've worked in both? What do you think would be helpful for people in Washington to know about the work happening in state capitals?
Oh, that's a big, interesting question. You know, it's funny because I have worked at all. Like, I've worked at the congressional level, I've worked at the Senate level, and now I've worked at the state level. The only place I actually haven't worked is in the White House, and I was not planning on coming to Illinois and staying and being a chief of staff here for a governor. It really boiled down to I have a really great boss, and I didn't want to leave. It's so different from being a chief of staff on the Hill. You know, when I was a chief of staff on the Hill, you're right. You have a smaller staff, you have a smaller footprint. You're doing really important work. And and it's different work. I mean, it's some of the stuff that you're focused on is just fundamentally different. Being in a governor's office, there's just nothing that's not your job. I mean, really, truly. And this like crashed home to me. I had taken the job as chief of staff. We were a couple months in, and we unfortunately had a shooting at a local company. It was pretty terrible. And we, rushed the governor out to speak to the media and to be there. And it was the first time that it really like kind of came home to me. Wow, like anything that happens in the state, we have to be all over, and for good reason, because people have that expectation of their governor, and they should. But I think that what I wish people in DC would understand sometimes is, particularly right now, that it's not a theoretical conversation for us about, how you talk about COVID or what you do to deal with the pandemic, or, whether or not there's going to be certain help sent to the states. I mean, we follow every single little piece of that very, very closely. And some of this stuff is life or death for us, particularly right now.
Yeah.
And having been around the Senate and the House as we've watched, for example, this state and local aid bill try to make its way through Congress, I think some of my colleagues here are like, well, yeah, I read in Politico this morning, they're debating it. And I'm like, we are so far away from a vote, and so it's a challenge, but it's just a different type of challenge. And I've loved it, to be honest. I mean, even as hard as this year has been, I think being able to be in the thick of it and help organize and, get in the middle of any crisis you're dealing with has just been, it suits my personality very well. And it gives me an enormous amount of pride to be part of all this stuff. So it's great work. I tell people all the time they should think about going to states and doing the work out here.
Well, voters elect candidates, and you never know what you're going to get once you elect somebody about their staff. And the people of Illinois have no idea how fortunate they are to have you as the governor's chief of staff. And I mean that. It's not just your personality that suits this job. It's like everything about you that suits this job. And this moment, as difficult as it is. You also do a lot of hiring, right? Mm-hmm. So when you bring people onto the governor's staff, what are you looking for in a staffer?
Oh, great question. I look for a lot of things. One, a sense of humor, really, genuinely. If somebody walks in and they just have no, sense of humor at all, it's going to be hard for me to get along with them. I want people who are really, really good at what they do and able to kind of run off and do it. I've worked for managers in the past that hire really, really smart people, and then they micromanage every little thing they're doing. And I don't know why you would do that. I want people that complement my weaknesses. I look for that in staffers. I'm trying to find somebody who, picks up at a part of my portfolio or resume that isn't as strong as it needs to be. When I worked on campaigns, I always hired a top-notch field director, for example, because I didn't come from field. I came from comms and research. So, so I want that. I want to see that people are committed and passionate about the job they're applying for. I don't really care whether you went to Harvard or, a state school or a community college, or you didn't go to college at all. I really don't look at that line of the resume. I want to see, a passion for the work. I want to see that there's kind of a sense in you about what your vision is for what you want to come do. And the best interviews I have with people, they walk in and they've got 1,000 ideas and they're so excited to be there. And there's something about the governor or his agenda that's really gotten them going. And it's you want to just see a sense of hey, this is someplace I really want to be and something I really want to be doing. Look, I also look for, I always ask people what their first job was. I want to hear, did you have customer service experience somewhere along the way? what was the first like hard situation you had to deal with at a job? I get really fascinating answers, especially from people who have been in the workplace, 20, 30 years. The stuff that they come back at you with is really interesting. And it's just, I want to, the governor has a rule that I also have that we affectionately call the no asshole rule.
Right on.
And
essential.
It's essential because like there's so much teamwork that goes into these jobs, and you spend so much time with these people. And if they're not nice and you don't like them and they're not empathetic and they can't, listen and hear a coworker and be respectful towards a coworker, that's incredibly important. And I'm always trying to figure that out. And I would say finally, one of the most important things right now is how hiring for diversity in your staff. You want racial and ethnic diversity, you want cultural diversity, you want geographic diversity, and you want those people sitting in a room with you when you're making decisions. So, I'm always kind of hiring with an eye to that, like, how are we making sure that this staff really represents the state, and that when people come in and meet with us, that they're like, oh, okay, there's somebody on that team that is speaking to something I really care about, or has an understanding of something I really care about. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of stuff that I look for in hiring.
Yeah, that's great. That's it actually leads me to a question I like to ask often. I have this fantasy that one day I will raise money and build a Hall of Fame to staffers on the National Mall. And I'm taking nominations. So I am really interested if you've got one in your nominee to the Staffer Hall of Fame.
The Staffer Hall of Fame. I actually have two.
Okay.
One would be Christy Roberts, who works at the DSCC now, ran John Tester's campaign a couple years ago. She's in many ways the unsung hero of the Raphael Warnock election down in Georgia. She got sent down there by the DS to help run things in the final 2 months.
Wow.
But we worked together years ago at the DS. She started in research like I did. We played on a flag football team together in D.C. and won the championship in 2016. And Christy and I were both on that. Very impressive. So one would be Christy, and the other one would be Quentin Fulks, who's he was my deputy on JB's campaign. He has stayed here in Illinois to help run the governor's political operation. We worked together at Priorities and at Emily's List. And he's just an incredibly hard worker and somebody who pays attention to every single little detail of what you're doing and what he's doing. So those would be my two.
Love it. Those are both great. Okay, one more for you. And it is really my favorite question, and it's called In the Vault. Tell me a time when you royally screwed up and what you learned from it.
This is a really good question. So when I was working for Congresswoman Betsy Markey, she was a great congresswoman from the 4th District of Colorado, elected to a district that was 6 points more Republican than it was Democratic. And we were in the midst of the craziness of 2009 and 2010, Obama's first term. There was a lot going on. You remember it fondly.
I was there with you every step of the way.
You were there with me. We, trying to make a decision about how she was going to legislate in that seat was incredibly difficult because at heart, Betsy is a true progressive. And so am I. And yet we were in this incredibly conservative district. And I remember we were trying to figure out where were the places that we needed to deviate from the national Democratic agenda, if you will. And one of the things we chose was the NRA. We decided that she was going to be more pro-gun because that was the makeup of the district. And I remember I came into her and there was a letter that the NRA wanted her to sign. And to be honest, I cannot remember what the topic was, but it was probably one of the inane, stupid things that they kind of circulated every 2 or 3 months. And I remember her looking at me going like, I really don't want to sign this letter. Like, it's really not what I want to do. And I made a whole argument to her that, look, the bill that they were referencing wasn't going to pass, and it just didn't really matter in the great scheme of things. And, this would be something that we could at least campaign on back at the district. And she still really didn't want to sign it, but she did because I pressured her to. And a year later, the NRA endorsed our opponent, even though she had like an A rating with them. And I couldn't get the thought of that stupid letter out of my head. I hadn't felt good about it when I was putting it in front of her. I knew she hadn't felt good about it. And I really took away from that, look, you should be responsive to the people you represent. You shouldn't just take a knee-jerk partisan position because you have a D or an R after your name. But you also shouldn't have set aside, your own personal beliefs, the things that you think are right and wrong, in order to try to achieve a political objective. And I will say that experience genuinely scarred me. I felt so terrible about it afterwards. And I apologized to Betsy later on because I just thought I had made a mistake in pushing her to do this. And then, to top it all off, the NRA completely screwed us in the election. So it wasn't even like the things that I had been trying to achieve got achieved. And it is a lesson that has stuck with me ever since. And I will say I'm grateful in the sense that it has led me to advise everybody I've worked for after to just be radically authentic. And, even if you believe in something that may seem at counter purposes to the district you represent or the place that you are, if it's that important to you, just hold that position and don't apologize for it. Explain it, talk about it, be ready to tell people why this is important to you, but don't compromise those things because you think you're going to get some political bump from it, because the reality is those things never work out that way.
That is such an important story, and we've, for those of us who have advised elected officials, we've all been there. And there are two things I want to call out. One is sometimes when you are the chief of staff, it's actually your job to say the unpopular thing, to put forward the option that is more political than the member might be thinking at that moment, right? It's your job to present options, explore downfalls, explore opportunities.
Right.
And, that means sometimes, as I said, putting forward an idea that maybe you don't even love in your heart, but your head, that's your role, is to play, the role of the calculator at times.
Well, and I'll tell you one other story, Jim, that you'll appreciate because you were part of this. So, you had the NRA example with Betsy, but then there was healthcare, right? And she was initially a no on the healthcare bill, for all different sorts of reasons. And it went through, we took that torturous path through the Senate and came back to the House. And thanks to Nancy Pelosi, it hit the House floor. And a couple days, about a week before the vote, Betsy said to me, I don't care what this does to my reelection. I'm going to be a yes on this bill. And I can't look my kids in the eye. And I knew at the time, I was like, you're absolutely right. We're just going to have to map it out. But to your point about being the unpopular person, right at that point in time, Barack Obama was coming to the Hill to give a rah-rah healthcare speech, right? And Betsy wanted to go to this thing worse than you could possibly imagine. I mean, she wanted to be there. And she said to me, well, I'm just going to call Rahm Emanuel and tell him I'm a yes. And I was like, no, you're absolutely not going to do that. I said, you're going to go into the White House and you're going to have a list of things that you're going to ask for the district. And, and not until he says yes to all those things are you going to come back and vote for that bill.
I remember that meeting. I remember that meeting. You and Betsy were on one couch.
Yeah.
Ram and I were on the other couch looking at each other. He had his notebook open and we went through that list of demands and you drove a hard bargain.
Yes. And to Ram's credit, he was like, I'll give you this, I'll give you this, I'll give you this. And I just remember, like, I was there to just make sure Betsy didn't cave because all she wanted to do was come in and be like, I'm a yes for healthcare. I'm here. I'll do it.
Well, that was the other thing that I was going to take from even the initial story. And this goes to Betsy and other members, like never forgetting purpose. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you have in spades. I am sure the governor benefits greatly from it and also, make sure that all those around him know it. It is like, what are you here for? And just newsflash, it's not to be reelected. That's not the purpose, right? It is to do good. And if you do good enough, you should get reelected. And I think so many people have forgotten that. And now they're in this trap.
Voters give you credit for that. They really, really do. And I'd be remiss to go through this whole podcast and not talk about my current boss, who's amazing.
Yes, I was going to ask. Yes.
He, one of the greatest things about JB is that he wants a robust debate in front of him. If you show up to a meeting and you are not ready to argue a position, even if it's counter to the one that he's holding and back it up with facts, you're not going to last long with him. He's an incredibly kind and interesting person, and he keeps that adage you just talked about, do what's best for people, and then the politics will follow, front of mind and things. And I see it pay off for him in so many different ways, even when in the moment that we made the decision, it seemed really hard to do whatever we were doing. But, people they give him credit for it on the back end. And, during the pandemic, he wakes up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He's a very early riser. He sleeps about 4 hours a night. He reads every little thing about COVID-19, the response, the research we have on it, what's going on with the vaccine, what's going on with testing. I mean, he is so involved in the details. Most of the times it's great. There are times when I start pulling my hair out a little bit, but you certainly want that as opposed to somebody who's detached from all the details. And but what I really appreciate about him is that there have been many times where I've walked into his office, closed the door, and said, "We can't do this," or "This is not a good idea," or "I disagree with you." There are times when he's overruled me. I mean, I think I win more than I lose, but there's times that he overrules me.
Sure.
And I respect that, and we move on. But he always listens. And I'm just always amazed at politicians and bosses, frankly, in the political sphere especially, who want people around them who are yes people, who just say, wow, you came up with such a brilliant idea, and thank God you came up with that idea, and we're, it's just so smart. I made that observation in front of JP once to a crowd, and he goes, well, what's that like? But he's a really, you want that kind of boss. I know that one of the points of this podcast is to talk to people about what it's like being on staff and everything. You want someone who is going to encourage debate. You want somebody who's intellectually curious. You want somebody who's going to treat you kindly, even when you disagree. You want someone who cares about what they're doing because it's the right thing to do, and not because it might be the popular thing to do, or it might be the most politically expedient thing to do. And I certainly have that in a boss right now. I've been very fortunate that I've worked for people in the past who've been that way. And I will say it really, you can't help but be driven by that mentality when you have been surrounded by it in your professional career. I think people sometimes, make a decision to go work for somebody or jump onto a campaign or jump into an office because they think, oh, this is a prominent person, or, they have a path to X, Y, Z. And I just always tell people, start with, is this a good person? Is this somebody you want to work for? Is this somebody that, you want to sit across and have a meal with? Like, is this somebody that you're going to be okay laying yourself out on the line for, because that really is what we do in these jobs. So,
that was so well put. And it is a perfect note to end on, because there's such wisdom in it. And I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for spending this time with me and being so candid and authentic with every answer. I am the biggest admirer of yours, and I can't thank you enough.
Well, I miss you, Jim Papa. I miss getting to work with you, and it was a real treat when you emailed me. I was like, oh gosh, it's great to actually talk to some of my old friends again.
I know. Well, let's change that. 21.
Yes.
Let's figure out something.
New year, new administration.
Exactly. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Well, friends, I can smell the jet fumes at National Airport, which means another episode of Staffer is adjourned. I want to thank you all for listening to the only show created for and about the people who work in government and politics at any level. I do have a quick favor to ask. Please follow, subscribe, and like the show on all of your favorite podcast platforms. Positive reviews are everything in this business, I'm told. And please make sure to sign up for episode alerts at staffershow.com and check out Staffer Show on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thanks all.